Hello and welcome to this. Is everybody there? Yes. Hello and welcome to this Anthro Day historical moment. Whatever follows, remember this may be the first global Anthro Day event, which is half sponsored by Vilnius University, a university without an anthropology department or center. We do, however, have a large and recently formed Lithuanian Anthropological Association. And this summer, we will have an anthropology conference, June 16th to 18th. I think in the chat, there will be a website address that you can reach if you're interested in the conference. If you are interested, please go to that website. This Zoom conversation in anthropology came about as a result of a series of impromptu interchanges about the historiography of anthropology. First, Professor Akhil Gupta of UCLA and President of the American Anthropological Association, together with his co-author, Jessie Stoolman, a PhD student who I think is defending her PhD tomorrow, if I remember right, wrote a presidential address titled Decolonizing Anthropology. This led to a large number of discussions on various AAA community sites and other anthropology sites. But the discussions got a turbo boost from Professor Herbert Lewis, who had a different reading of anthropology's historiography, in the US at least. This led to a veritable avalanche of responses, mostly people siding with one party or the other. For the most part, the discussions in the main thread were thoughtful and impressive. We, Elisa and I, thought it might be a nice closure, at least for now, to have Professors Lewis and Gupta and Jessie Stoolman get together and discuss their respective perspectives, which is not so easy to say. We now have that opportunity to listen to them. Fortunately, also, Professor Gitika D from Delhi University and a committee member for the upcoming conference will comment on their discussion and extend how their perspective might apply or not apply to South Asia. So without further ado, I hand over the Zoom screen, so to speak, to my co-moderator, Professor Elisa Sobo from San Diego State University. Elisa?
Hi there. Wow, it is great to see so many people in the room. Not that I can see everybody, of course, and that's kind of one of the bad things about having such a big conversation. Usually these conversations, and there have been quite a few sponsored by Vilnius University, are rather intimate and rather small. So a downside here is because there's more of us in the room than can fit on the page, we have to be a little more structured. I'm just going to show you a few slides now. Let's see if I can work this and talk at the same time. There we go. To just kind of help set the tone. Usually, as I said, the tone is very casual, but in this case, some of the comments that came into Victor and me when people found out we were organizing this, I remember one that was just basically, you guys like playing with fire. And that took me, it kind of took me aback because I said, what are you talking about? This is a conversation that needs to happen. But it does seem that in some points of view, this is not a conversation, it's a debate. And so we just wanted to set this up by saying, you know what, no, this is not a debate. This really needs to be a conversation about anthropology, about the ideas that Professor Lewis and Professor Gupta and Jessie Stoolman have brought up, because that's the only way we can move forward. And in thinking about this response of, oh, be careful, it occurred to me that there was a lot of parallel between some of my research around vaccine selectivity and conspiracy theorizing and the polarization that happens with some of these political issues. And I just have a couple slides here, and I just pulled them out of a prior presentation from maybe 5 years ago, because we just want to make sure that the same thing doesn't happen. We want to make sure that we don't end up polarizing into two sides and kind of creating this weird, really a false binary, because what should be going on is conversation. And if we start to take sides and say, I'm in this camp, I'm in that camp, we're going to start, you guys are mostly anthropologists, so you're familiar with this kind of process of polarization in which it just sort of catalyzes and pushes people further and further and further apart, in which who I am and my identity as belonging to this camp or the other becomes much more important than the actual details of the conversation. So there are a couple of techniques that we know about that can sort of stave that off, but we just want to acknowledge that could be happening, and it's not our intent at all to have people take sides. It is more of our intent to move on to a conversation, and to conversate, we have to collaborate. And part of ensuring collaboration is really being careful about our language, and being careful about not putting the potential, quote, other side on the defensive, because once you start to put someone on the defensive, they're going to dig their heels in. This is just human, right? As I said, we understand a little bit about human behavior, and we should know better. We need to find the common ground. We need to find the common cause so that we can collaborate to produce what I think we all hope is a better future for our discipline. One thing that is very clear, is becoming more and more clear, is that the words we choose matter. And I would caution all of us to try and avoid choosing these shorthand terms that have become politicized, that become polarizing, because they become sort of like a red flag to a bull. And what I mean is, I'll just pause here. Yesterday, in a preparatory conversation for a panel that's happening 2 weeks from now at San Diego State University, one of the participants asked very sincerely, can I use the phrase white supremacy? So this was the casual conversation of the organizing committee, and people at San Diego State were like, what? Of course you can. But at this person's university, that word was off limits. And it was off limits for very political reasons that I think most people in this room would disagree with. But the point being, if she were to use that term, it does become very polarizing, because people hear that term, and without putting more complexity into it and explaining what she means by that, they might assume something. So the lesson here is that if we try to avoid jargon that has become a signaling for whatever quote side you're on, that is one thing that really helps conversations to move forward more smoothly. And it's just something to think about as we try and move forward and do something very productive here, which I am very excited about. And I think that the opposite side of the people who say you're playing with fire is the people who say you're really going to build up something better and newer and help anthropology move forward into a brighter future. And so with that, I'm just going to pop up onto the screen the sort of running order here of what we're going to do. First, we're going to have some of the ideas presented by our esteemed speakers, and then our esteemed discussant will discuss. We'll have some responses, and then we'll have some Q&A. And with the Q&A, what we'll do first is we'll begin with some of the pre-submitted questions that we've received, and then we'll move on to questions from the audience. And you can use, at that point, you can go ahead and use the hand function that's in your Zoom controls. And we will, I hope, be engaging, not in a debate, but in a discussion, in a conversation, in the spirit of what anthropology as a discipline would hope to do for the future. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing screen and hand the microphone
back to me. Hello?
Yes, off we go.
Hi, so let me introduce Professor Herbert Lewis. Herbert Lewis is a professor emeritus at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He received his PhD from Columbia University in 1963. His early field work was in the West Indies, first at St. John, 1955, then in Martinique in 1956. From 1958 to 1960, he worked in Ethiopia, from which came the book Jimma Abad Jafar, An Aroma Monarchy. Thereafter, he did field work on ethnicity and cultural change among Jews from Yemen and Morocco in Israel. That was in 1975, 1977, and he wrote a book called After the Eagles Landed, The Yemenites of Israel in 1989. Near the end of the 20th century, he came across a vast archival collection of personal accounts from more than 200 Oneida men and women recorded between 1940 and 1942. This resulted in the book Oneida Lives, Long Lost Voices of Wisconsin Oneidas, published in 2005. Since the mid-1990s, he has been engaged in researching and writing about the history of anthropology. On this subject, he has written a book called In Defense of Anthropology, an investigation of the critique of anthropology, 2014. So Herb, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I want to thank Victor and EJ for suggesting and arranging this discussion. And thanks to all the other participants and those zooming in today. I must start by noting that the University of Wisconsin in Madison occupies ancestral land of the Ho-Chunk people, a place they call Dejope. In 1832, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Despite decades of ethnic cleansing, the Ho-Chunk are still here. The University of Wisconsin respects the sovereignty of the 12 Indian nations of Wisconsin. I must also add that the applied anthropologist and commissioner of Indian Affairs, Phileo Nash, assigned the trust land to the Ho-Chunk, overruling the Solicitor General of the United States in order to gain that nation their desired status under the Indian Reorganization Act. Furthermore, action anthropologist Nancy Lurie worked with Menominee social work professor Ada Deer to successfully overturn the termination of the Menominee Reservation and restore it to its people in the 1970s, late 60s and 1970s. Now, I realize there is great variation within the American anthropological community today as in the past. There were then, as there are now, major differences in outlook and interest based on many concatenations of individual background, personality, ideology, motivation, training, and experience. Nevertheless, it is possible to speak of two distinctly different anthropologies. An earlier one, let's call it modern or classical, and the one of the 2020s. In the earlier anthropology, into which the most senior of us here were enculturated, was an optimistic and ambitious field whose members believed that our endeavor to view all human groups all over the world, from pre-human origins through the earliest manifestations of culture and human social behavior until today, was special and important. It was a strategy for understanding what makes us human, what makes us all alike, despite the remarkable range of cultural behaviors, ideas, and social arrangements that humans are capable of. Marshall Solins called it the encompassing human science, the comparative study of the human condition. Our field grew out of lively curiosity about the world's peoples, as well as a belief in the scientific method. We thought that our intimate firsthand engagement with members of other communities, where they live, gave us deep appreciation for different ways of being and doing things. We did research with as many different peoples as possible, usually with ones whose cultures were thriving, though changing, but also trying to get information about ways that were already past, known only through archaeology. In early days, American ethnographers and linguists worked with groups whose distinctive languages, beliefs, and ways of life were in imminent danger of dying with their carriers. They believed it was their duty to save this knowledge for the future of their descendants as well as for humanity in general. American anthropology was not restricted to a savage slot, regardless of what people say these days. Franz Boas made it clear from his earliest days at Columbia that the aim of anthropology was to study all peoples of whatever type or culture. We did research in communities of every size, from cities to tiny communities, among remote populations that no other disciplines cared about. Indeed, no one else cared about these smaller groups of people except missionaries who wanted to change them and government officials who tried to control them. We just wanted to know them. As a result of our fieldwork experiences and training in four-field anthropology, we wrote and taught against racial determinism. Anthropology was the primary, really the only field to strive to disprove notions of inherited biological inferiority and to fight racism. As Lee Baker put it back in the 90s, Boas and several of his students at Columbia joined activists in an effort to liberate African Americans from the grip of claims of inferiority and to establish a more rigorous academic discourse to explain race and culture. He goes on, the change in the social sciences followed and sometimes led slow changes in arduous political and social structures that would eventually topple Plessy in 1954. End of quote. Thurgood Marshall and Kenneth Clark used Boasian anthropology as critical elements in their arguments in Brown versus Board of Education. Our other great challenge was to caution against ethnocentrism, to preach understanding of ways that were different from our own, and to teach that one's own way is not necessarily the best. In the words of Sidney Mintz, our predecessors not only told the world, but showed the world that all peoples are equally human, equal in what they are, equal in what they have done for humankind. Nobody else at that time had said it and demonstrated it. Anthropologists did. Today, excuse me one sec. Today's American anthropology is very different. Not everyone and everywhere, but at the center, at the commanding heights of the field, it has changed in the most profound ways from what it was in the middle of the last century. The hegemony of the new anthropology is manifest in the direction and organization of the AAA annual meetings, the editors, editorial boards, and contents of the association's publications, the election statements of candidates for offices in the association and its sections. The dominant vision is evident in the course offerings at the leading departments of anthropology and in the presidential address that brings us here today. Current cultural and social anthropology is increasingly focused on what Sherry Ortner called dark anthropology. She describes it as, quote, anthropology that focuses on the harsh dimensions of social life, power, domination, inequality, and oppression, as well as on the subjective experience of these dimensions in the form of depression and hopelessness. That's the end of that quote. Joel Robbins labeled this a predisposition towards the suffering subject. Today's courses and publications are based on problems of violence, victimization, immiseration, and misery. The field that saw itself primarily as a study of human diversity, the humanistic science of the human, has been transformed into the recorder, if not the writer, of wrongs. Akhil Gupta and Jesse Stoolman listed high priority topics for today's anthropology as the study of genocides and mass killings, the study of slavery and structural violence, of legal treaties and the political systems that enable their abrogation or enforcement, of forced migration and internally displaced populations, of reparations, land back initiatives, truth and reconciliation, redistributive and restitutive justice, and the redressal of historical wrongs, and critical approaches to borders and nationalism. The thrust, the moral center, the subject matter, the concerns of the field have changed. Central aspects of the earlier anthropology, as well as its accumulated knowledge, have been forgotten and frequently disparaged. Today's anthropology is a new field, and so be it. It's a new day, a new discipline, and this generation must strive and thrive to do right, to do well, to do whatever it can to ameliorate the many miseries of the world. More power to them. They must do what their understandings, their research, their intellects, their training, and their values tell them is right and necessary. But, and you knew there would be a but, There's a central theme in this new anthropology that is unnecessary. It's wrong. It's a waste of effort. And that is the wholesale assault on earlier anthropology. Now, please notice that the coming annual meetings of the AAA will be dedicated to what steps can be collectively taken to make the field accountable to its historic and current harms. Now, it's certainly appropriate for today's anthropologists to attend to the field's current harms. It is not appropriate with respect to an earlier era that they don't know. And it ill behooves them to spend so much time denigrating a field that, as Sid Mintz put it, not only told the world, but also showed the world that all peoples are equally human, equal in what they are, equal in what they have done for humankind. The presidential address that started this process reports the new generation's protests regarding the failure of US anthropology to deal with questions of race and racialization, with indigenous land disposition and denial of indigenous sovereignty, and with the continuing global impacts of militarism, colonialism, and imperialism. By all means, they should tackle these challenges. But attacking an imagined anthropology of 50 to 100 years ago is not a useful way to accomplish these important aims. This generation is removed from the earlier anthropology by several decades. They haven't studied earlier anthropology. Courses in the history of the field have just about disappeared from elite universities. Earlier works are rarely consulted, nor do the critics have the empathy, objectivity, or historical understanding of the context or the people of the past to do it accurately or fairly. Professor Gupta requested that critics give him substantive criticisms regarding his address rather than generalizations. I have only time for a couple now. The authors write, without diminishing the enormity of what our anthropological ancestors accomplished, we see them better as fallible humans rather than gods or demigods. I think this is a fairly disingenuous claim because it's virtually impossible to find acknowledgement of any accomplishment whatsoever in their talk. Out of 300 bibliographical references, there are a scant handful in which earlier anthropology is presented in even a neutral light. The other 290, give or take, have been selected clearly for the purpose of critique and denigration. They use the rhetorical technique of heaping a bunch of these citations after each major claim as though they proved it. But an inspection of many of these citations indicates much less support than they would have us believe. And as an aside, I only know of one reference to earlier anthropologists as gods, and that was by Zora Neale Hurston. Her words were taken for the title of a book favorable to Boasian anthropology, a work that does not appear among the 300. As is usual in the critical literature, the talk made it seem as though there were basically two American anthropologists, Franz Boas and Margaret Mead. Actually, there were a few more of us. According to the Fifth International Directory of Anthropologists of 1975, edited by Saul Tax, there were at least 2,700 anthropologists in the USA and Canada. By far the largest number of these individuals were cultural or social anthropologists, and they did research in every part of the world. The yearbook lists 90 different topics of interest for cultural anthropology. And let me stress that these include colonialism and colonization, imperialism and imperial organization, that more than 70 people listed these interests. Action anthropology, Saul Tax and previously mentioned Nancy Lurie, important among them. Complex organizations and institutions, including total institutions like asylums and prisons, drugs and drug use, but it was after the 1960s. Ethics in anthropology, fates of indigenous peoples, gerontology, labor relations, marginality and deviance, medical anthropology, ethnomedicine and public health, migrants, migration and migrant labor, messianic and revitalization movements, ethnicity and race relations, poverty, sex roles and sexual relations. And the last I'll mention is revolutionary and national liberation movements. Anthropology, half a century ago, anthropologists were more concerned about these issues than current discourse recognizes. In fact, as an intellectual community, we were decidedly closer in our political and moral outlook to the current generation than they want to believe. The authors write of how significant it would have been for Margaret Mead to do in 1925 what they, 96 years later, imagined she should have done. What she did, however, in shaking up American society's ideas of child rearing, sex, and the relativity of cultures, they see as insignificant or worse. They believe Mead meant her message for a white middle-class self, that's quote, white middle-class self, people presumably not worth impressing with the idea that there are other ways to live or that other people might have more satisfactory approaches to life. The authors have a similar problem with Horace Miner's Nakirema, a humorous demonstration of cultural relativism as an antidote to the malady of ethnocentrism. Somehow they consider this piece also a project of cultural critique and self-estrangement directed only at the same white audience as Mead's. It seems as though they think that Black folks and other people of color don't use bathrobes, comb their hair, brush their teeth, take medicines, or go to doctors, or have a sense of humor. After favorably mentioning Boas's published letter protesting anthropologists as spies in World War I, the authors say many anthropologists, most famously Cora Dubois and Ruth Benedict, joined the war effort during the Second World War. And after that war, many of those who had served in theaters of war around the world became anthropologists and joined the growing higher education system in the 1950s and 60s. This generation did its fieldwork at the very moment when US military and imperial power was at its pinnacle and when nationalism and militarism were inextricably entwined, end of quote. Now, an audience primed to believe the worst about nationalism, US military, and the Cold War will naturally assume a nefarious relationship between that generation and the US military and imperial power. It automatically taints those people without any evidence of actual connection. Furthermore, the association of Cora Dubois and Ruth Benedict with war puts them under a cloud as well, before an audience that might not realize the context of 90, 80 years ago. It would be helpful to explain that Japan had invaded and was brutalizing the populations of Manchuria, China, Taiwan, Korea, the Philippines, Burma, Malaya, Indochina, Indonesia, New Guinea, the Pacific Islands. They had a bad defeat in India, actually. Aside from the purposeful and industrial scale murder of well over 6 million people whom they deemed inferior and useless, Germans under Hitler invaded and brutalized Poland, Czechoslovakia, Norway, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Lithuania, Ukraine, and the USSR. Would today's principles call for neutrality under those circumstances? Despite the horrors of that war, Ruth Benedict's book, The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, was her attempt to make the Japanese understandably human, only culturally different, to a people, the American people, that had been at war against the Japanese and subjected to racist propaganda against them for many years. In around 300 pages, she had demonstrated the Boasian technique of turning otherness into difference, an idea that only a few years after the war was its own kind of revelation, writes Charles King in his book, Gods of the Upper Air. In fact, the Japanese anthropologist Takao Safue, commenting on the article by Diane K. Lewis, which is cited by the authors, wrote, Ruth Benedict's The Chrysanthemum and the Sword is well accepted and widely read among the Japanese general public even today, because it points out many basic traits of the national character and personality which the Japanese themselves had never been aware of. Charles King writes admiringly of Ruth Benedict, as well as Margaret Mead, Ella Deloria, and Zora Neale Hurston in his book, Gods of the Upper Air. Why couldn't this book have been included among the 300 references? Thank you.
Many thanks for that. Well, we could stop for questions. I have a million myself. I think the best thing is to stick to the table of contents, the script, and go ahead to our next speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce the next presentation, and this will be by Akhil Gupta and Jesse Stoolman. Akhil Gupta is former president of the American Anthropological Association and professor of anthropology and co-director of the Center for India and South Asia at UCLA. He's the author of Post-Colonial Developments and editor of Culture, Power, Place, and Anthropological Locations. His book, Red Tape, was awarded the Kumaraswamy Prize by the Association for Asian Studies. Recent publications include The Promise of Infrastructure in 2018 and The Anthropology of Corruption, also 2018. His latest research is to be found in a book manuscript on BPOS and call centers entitled Future Tense, which will be published by Duke University Press. Jessie Stoolman is a graduate student at UCLA in the Department of Anthropology. Her dissertation project focuses on how the Moroccan archival landscape shapes collective memory of Black Jewish history. She has published academic and non-academic writing in international journals, including Hespris Tumata and Asymptote. She aspires to join the publishing world to encourage accessibility in academic writing. Together with Akhil, Jessie is co-author of Decolonizing US Anthropology, the paper that Akhil drew from in his presidential address to the American Anthropological Association in 2021. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Victor and EJ, for arranging this. And I'm going to go first, and then Jessie is going to take over from me. So I want to keep the focus on the main question that we ask in our paper. I want this to be a substantive discussion, not a point counterpoint kind of argument. So the main question that we ask in the paper is, how do we make US anthropology more anti-racist, right? So that is the question we are trying to answer. And what I'm going to do is show you why looking at the past is an important part of answering that question. And so I just want to walk you through the steps of why we came to that part of our talk. And the question that I would pose back to Professor Lewis is, the question that he may wish to take up in response to, if it's truly a response to a paper, is what is your proposal of making US anthropology more anti-racist, right? So what I don't want to do is I don't want to play the role of Sancho Panza and keep pointing out that Professor Lewis is not slaying giants, but tilting at windmills. That would be completely, unproductive. So the one thing we are saying in this paper is that what we are doing in the paper is highlighting work that has already been done and is being done currently, that is moving the needle to making US anthropology a more anti-racist discipline. Okay, so that's what we're doing. We're highlighting the work that is showing, demonstrating, pointing to pathways to make US anthropology more anti-racist. Whether we like it or not, and Professor Lewis doesn't like the references we have chosen, that work is out there. That is the work that's being done. So I, as the president, was listening to our membership. I was listening to what the current generation of people are doing. And I was saying, this is what we hear, right? So the paper reflects, in a way, the work that has been done and that is being done, and that the younger generation of people are interested in. So all we are doing in the paper is drawing attention to that work for parts of the membership that may not know that that work exists. They haven't maybe seen it or read it or debated it or had a conversation with it. So we think that's very important for all of us to be engaging that work. Whether we agree or not is really beside the point, right? So it doesn't matter really if you agree with it or not, but I think all of us should be reading and engaging it. Okay, and so our answer to how do we make US anthropology more anti-racist is to do three things, right? The first one, which is really the main focus of the paper, is to change present practices by which we train students, by which we mentor students and junior faculty and undergraduates and graduate students, how we promote faculty of color, how we include faculty of color in anthropology departments, and not only in departments, but all the other contexts in which anthropologists work and receive training. So anthropology departments are not the only places where people are trained, right? So it could be NGOs, it could be government departments, it could be museums, it could be field schools, businesses, etc., right? So what we are saying is we need to think carefully about, interrogate, and change practices of what we call white norming in the discipline, right? So that's the major focus of the paper, changing, how do we change present practices? And again, we draw upon ideas that are already there, that have been proposed by other anthropologists, and we highlight those ideas in the paper. The second thing we do is we say that in order to make the discipline more anti-racist, we have to change how we imagine the future of the discipline. So questions like, who will be the next generation of anthropologists? What do we want the discipline to look like in the future, right? What kinds of topics or themes or ideas do we want to see as being at the center of the discipline as it moves into the future, right? So for example, people might say, well, the major existential threat to human civilization right now is that of climate change, right? So if that is the case, then the future of the discipline, one would think, would involve research on climate change in some central way, right? So these are the kinds of questions that we need to be asking, like what do we want the future of the discipline to look like? And third, to make the discipline more anti-racist, we need to provide alternative stories about its past. Because the question of how we got to the present, how we got to where we are, right? And how do we imagine different possibilities has to do with how we interpret the past, right? So interpreting the past differently, telling different stories about the past, multiplying the narratives about the past is extremely important to thinking about a different present and a different future for anthropology. Different practices in the present can be empowered by looking at multiple pasts, multiple genealogies. How did we get here? The stories that we tell ourselves about the discipline both enable and constrain. They allow us to do certain things, but they also prevent us from doing certain things. So the past, as we know, is multiple. You can tell many different stories about the past. Which ones do we choose to focus on? Why do we choose to focus on the ones that we choose, right? What other stories are possible? So if we are looking to change the present, we also need to tell ourselves a different story about the past of the discipline. So our focus in the paper on anthropology's past, on anthropology's history, is just one of the things that we think needs to be changed. It's teaching students about forgotten or suppressed genealogies. It's finding alternative histories of how we got to the present. And any disciplinary history necessarily has to ask critical questions. Any disciplinary history proceeds forward by asking critical questions of the past, right? How did we get here? What has been overlooked? Any history has to deal with real life complexities and complicities, right? So the amazing accomplishments that have been recorded that Professor Lewis is defending, which, by the way, we fully agree with, the amazing accomplishments have to be understood alongside and in relation to real mistakes and real harms, right? So we can't whitewash the history of anthropology, and it is by no means our intention to to sort of say, okay, the history of anthropology only consists of things that went wrong, right? So that's by no means what we are doing here. What we are saying is let's not just have a celebratory story, because that celebratory story actually is harmful to people who were the objects of who are not recognized as that, right? Who feel that they were harmed by some of those things. And a Whiggish, my argument is that a Whiggish history serves nobody well, right? So if you just say everything we did was wonderful, was great, and we don't acknowledge if you don't acknowledge that there was anything wrong or that anything could have been done differently, we cannot move forward because we can't say what are the alternatives, right? And in this regard, I mean, just like I can't become a better teacher if I don't acknowledge that I made any mistakes in the past, that there was room for improvement in my teaching, right? If I don't acknowledge that, then I can't become a better teacher, right? I can't become a better anthropologist if I don't look at my own practices and say, oh, I could have done that interview better. I've learned some new things now that could have enabled me to have done something differently. So every generation and every theoretical movement revises the past by asking new questions about history. So for example, this applies to national history, it applies to world history, as much as it applies to the history of disciplines. So for example, when feminist anthropology first emerged, it rearranged the canon, it reread classic works, it asked new questions about the work that had been done. That did not mean like a rejection. It was not a rejection of the past, but it was a rethinking, a reevaluation to see what was missing, to see what kinds of things could be added. And what we are calling for is actually not to ignore the past. We're not asking that, the work of past anthropologists be rejected. What we are asking instead is that we reread the ethnographic record, right? We reread the ethnographic record carefully to see how, at the time that the events that were recorded how some of the stuff that was happening at that time, to say, for example, between 1850 and 1900, the whole opening up of the West, so-called opening up of the West, involved, of course, a lot of expropriation of native land. And the question of how that was dealt with in the ethnographic record is something that we feel is very important. So you go back and reread the ethnographic record for things that may have not been noticed or been missing or simply been there but have not been recorded by historians. Okay, so what we are calling for, and this is the only one thing that I will say against what Professor Lewis said. The one thing, what we are calling for is not to read history through the lens of present day concerns. That's not what we are calling for. We are actually saying we are anti-presentist in the things as we are calling for. What we are saying is we're not taking current concerns and reading them back into history, into the history of anthropology. What we are doing through the section on counterfactual history is we are saying, let us focus centrally on what would have been important in the time, at the time when those anthropologists were working, right? So if you were working with Californian Indians in the early 1900s, you would have had to deal with a history of genocide. You would have had to deal with the consequences of land expropriation, of people being driven into reservations, and all of that. So the questions we are asking is, what would have been the important questions for people at that time? Not important questions for those of us today, but at that time. And how did that show up in the ethnographic record, right? How did it show up? If it didn't show up, why did it not show up? It's a historiographical question, but I'll let Jesse raise some of those issues. But I'll end with just saying this. We cannot separate the history of anthropology from US history, the history of US anthropology from US history, right? Those two things are interconnected. And as we rewrite the history, as we rewrite US history to see that the founding violence of US history based on Native Americans, on the genocide of Native Americans and on enslavement as a central part of US history, we have to rethink the history of anthropology along the same lines. So I'll let Jesse pick it up from there.
I'm just going to break in to say that speaking of time, we've gone over time with the presentation. So Jesse, if you could be brief, and I apologize even for having to ask this.
Not a problem at all. So I'll just add, the implications of the call that we outlined in the article to make visible a multiplicity of histories of this discipline. Really fundamentally asks for us to broaden the anthropological canon to include the work of professional ancestors whose voices may have been forgotten or repressed, including individuals that Dr. Lewis mentioned, like Zora Neale Hurston, and including many anthropologists of color whose work has long been ignored in the teaching of history of the discipline, as well as interlocutors in other disciplines. We spend a lot of time in our paper talking about the contributions of thinkers who were not trained as anthropologists, but whose writing shone a critical light on the forms of scientific racism that were woven into early anthropology, like W.E.B. Du Bois, who we mentioned extensively, and even those who preceded him in Boaz by decades, like Frederick Douglass and Antonin Fermat. It's also important to read anthropological work on Native Americans, for example, alongside documents produced by those Native Americans who worked as critical intermediaries for anthropologists, but also produced their own narratives. This is the type of work, for example, that we see in Margaret Bruhat's book, Savage Kin, that really tries to demystify the relationships between anthropologists and their intermediaries and make those relations a center point of inquiry for us as scholars in training. And finally, this historiography would be much richer if it were not focused on singular figures like Boaz, but on the relationship between these anthropologists and those who are Glass's assistants, as well as among the many other anthropologists that form a part of this founding discipline. So I think I would just like to end by reiterating that our call is not to disavow the ethnographic record, but to encourage a reading that asks what it can say, what this record has said and what was not said about genocidal violence against Indigenous and Black communities, and the other themes that we highlight in the paper, like the breaking of treaties, structural violence, the forced displacement of populations, denial of citizenship and rights to people of color, and the redressal of historical wrongs, relationship with non-human beings, and the history of extractive industries. So we really are not calling for the ethnographic record to be discarded, but instead to encourage in the training of, new scholars like myself, the new generation, reading these texts with that sort of lens. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think Victor is now going to introduce our discussant. And Victor is muted.
I got so wrapped up in the discussion that I forgot to unmute myself. So let me introduce Dr. Gitika D. She has an amazingly difficult task, and I know she's up for it. She certainly is one of the anthropologists that I've come to know and who I admire tremendously for her actual brilliance as an anthropologist and thinker. Let me say a little bit more about her. She is an Indian sociologist, social anthropologist, specializing in the political anthropology of patronage politics, anthropology of violence, social movements, and anthropology of policy. She has been teaching sociology since 2004 and is currently an associate professor at Hindu College, University of Delhi, India. Her current research interests include the following: generating a sociology of rights, trust, and political obligations in India. Try and do that. To trace the contours of Indian political sociology in the early years of its disciplinary formation, and in so doing, she has done a thorough scholarly reappraisal of the political ethnographies of F.G. Bailey, mapping the contemporary resonance of his oeuvre for political anthropology. She has also, like Bailey, explored the habitus of research and pedagogical practices in sociology departments in India and Indian universities. So please let me introduce, and let's hear what Professor Gitika D has to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dimang and Professor Sobo for inviting me to participate in this discussion. I read the presidential speech by Professor Gupta and Jesse Stoolman, as also Professor Lewis was very kind enough to send in his response letter to Professor Gupta. So this is what I have to say, and given the time zones that we are traversing here, I'll just go to what I have to say straight away. But with two caveats in a way. I have a stake in the debate, definitely, but I am not here for a real confrontation. So the confrontation happens in another zone. It's outside my zone. So that's one thing which is probably something which is liberating for me. The other question which Victor pointed out at the beginning of the program or the introduction essentially is that whether we are here to provide any sort of closure, I'm afraid I won't be able to do that, because I'm here to actually point out what are the productive tensions in this debate. So here goes. As I read it, and I'm, of course, I could have misread what is the emphasis or what is the intent of both the speakers. So what I get from Professor Gupta and Dr. Stoolman's wide-ranging statement for decolonizing US anthropology, which they call it how to make it anti-racist, it takes off from the premise that it is the need of the hour. So the opening question for Gupta and Stoolman is this, that how does one decolonize and situate anthropological scholarship from the US in a specific history without recentering the US once again? These are all in the speech. The second thing that they seek to accomplish is through an exercise in speculative history that maps the paths US anthropology has not taken and seek to imagine what it could have been if those sideline themes were taken up and engaged with. That gives full play to the forgotten branches of US anthropology. Finally, they seek to draw out the implications of this decolonized anthropology for the everyday life of anthropology departments in the US in terms of mentoring, publishing, and general reorientation of their academic cultures. Professor Lewis and others along with him responded to this endeavor in the following terms, as I read it. They ask us to pause and have a proper measure of what would have been lost if the discipline in the speculative history is indeed actual. So that's the first thing. They also uphold essentially the inherited ideal of anthropology, which is everyone studying everyone, as inherently critical, democratizing, and an anti-colonial epistemology. For them, it makes little sense to abandon such exalted ideal to saddle the students of the current generation with the guilt of harm and injuries inflicted by the discipline. And the third essential point that they make is whether being in an apologetic mode would be a disservice to the legacy of the service that anthropologists have rendered to communities by recording their cultures. Deploying this knowledge for control or intervention is secondary to the primary intent of recording. So this is my reading of what Gupta and Stoolman on one hand and Professor Lewis and others on the other hand portrayed. It goes without saying that these responses to this disciplinary logjam are in no way exhaustive, given the long and diverse history of the discipline in the US, one of its foremost locales of practice. Yet one has to come to grips with it because it is a disagreement over the destiny of the discipline and the profession that is manifest as claims over its past and history. I speak here both as a practitioner of the discipline in India, as well as a teacher to undergraduate students, but the focus is equally to impart the fundamental tenets of the discipline, as well as to make students aware of the discursive terrain in which the practice of the discipline has been constituted historically, with a motive to make them self-reflexive about the conditions of possibility of anthropological or sociological research in India. The spirit in which I'm presenting this must be therefore viewed as an invitation to reflect on the way to harness the tensions between boundary maintenance of the discipline through consolidating the disciplinary legacies and the historical development in the practices and methods of the discipline, both emerging out of political imperatives as well as by interrogating the underlying philosophies of anthropology's study of the other. I believe it is this productive tension in American anthropology that could inform the futures of anthropology elsewhere. How does anthropology gain from this tension between the canonical version of the discipline, which itself has its diverse historical tellings and interpretations, and utilize critical histories drawn from disciplines other than anthropology, such as the concerns of post-colonial studies or critical theory? The debate on anthropology's future has to be pegged around this dynamic between what is consolidated and what is left open for generating an autocritic. In that spirit, I limit myself to 3 observations on themes that may speak to both sides of the conversation. The first, in what circumstances the call for decolonizing US anthropology arose? Response to that question would depend on whether one holds that anthropology has been complicit with colonialism and how. It has been argued quite persuasively that the mainstay of professional anthropology was not only reluctant to be in direct service of colonialism, but in most instances was at loggerheads with the policies of the colonial governments and their administrators. This may not hold if one takes a little expansive understanding of these complicities, without taking away the epistemological integrity of the anthropological quest by its individual practitioners. This becomes quite evident, for instance, if we ask what institutional, economic, geopolitical, and sociological conditions facilitate that quest for particular constituencies of anthropologists on certain terms and not others. We know that neither calling out the connections between anthropology and colonialism, nor the calls for decolonization of American anthropology are recent. Gupta notes at least 3 moments in the history of the discipline this has occurred, each one accompanied by larger stirring in public discourse. the 60s civil rights movement, the Reaganian era's war on drugs and its ramifications, and the current conundrum of Black Lives Matter. What this indicates is the fact that both the constitution and reconstitution, in this case, decolonization of disciplines, are shaped in the context of national social issues, the hegemonic intellectual currents of the times, the political impetus of national states and their geopolitical hegemony, and the dynamics of social power. Decolonizing US anthropology at home and abroad would thus have to interrogate the ways in which the new languages of power, new social groups, new terms of academic engagement, and new subjectivities are inaugurated through hegemonic discourses both inside and outside the academia. Under these conditions, the fact that a new generation of anthropologists are raising charges comparable to the earlier ones of failing to counteract the effects of the hegemonic character and practices of the discipline perhaps point to the fact that the problem of colonialism in anthropology in US or elsewhere is not one of its presence, but persistence. A decolonizing agenda would then have to be constituted as an issue that not only has real material consequences for its practitioners, but will have to take into account the complex sociologies of knowledge creation that determine the contours of disciplines historically. Thus, at every critical juncture of the discipline, we need to ask how to accomplish this political and critical task. Clearly, the problematic of decolonization is as much about anthropology's possible complicity with colonialism as ways in which currents of public discourse and their reconfiguration of the intellectual and institutional configuration tend to refocus the issues of production and reception of anthropological knowledge. Evidently, how knowledge generated by anthropologists have been viewed, appropriated, and deployed by the entities on whose behalf, at whose behest, with whose support that knowledge is being produced is a question of tremendous significance in this context. Even as one seeks the sources of this persistent quest to decolonize in altered political contexts of the discipline, one may not overlook other impetuses either. Today, anthropological knowledge is increasingly seen as a co-produced cultural resource than anthropologists' exclusive possession. And anthropology's truth claim is open for greater scrutiny and even contestation from different quarters. These, coupled with older questions of voice and representation, makes it imperative for active decolonizing agenda to acknowledge this heterodoxy in arriving at the truth of anthropological knowledge. To a large extent, the current charge of colonial practices in the discipline is a manifestation of this awareness, which in turn is a function of the awareness of the politics of production of anthropological knowledge. Clearly, since the worlds we inhabit have changed, the earlier discourse of a pure anthropological quest of studying other cultures cannot be sustained any longer, but have to be subject to renewed scrutiny. This is the first point, kind of theme that I had to talk about. The second point, or the second theme that I see in this debate is what constitutes decolonization. What are the ways to accomplish it in our times? Gupta and Stoolman imagined a decolonizing project as a reshaping of the discipline in anthropology through an induction of series of themes into the disciplinary agenda. The study of genocides and mass killings, the study of slavery and structural violence, the study of legal treaties and political systems that enable their abrogation or enforcement, the study of forced migration, the study of the kinship of humans and non-human animals, the study of reparations, illegal land seizures, colonial plunder inflicted on brown and black people throughout the globe, critical approaches to borders and nationalism, to name a few. These are all well-meaning interventions to decolonize the discipline, which has been underway for quite some time, as their long, 20 pages reference list is testimony to. But as we know, any list such as this always tends to attract the accusations of being arbitrary, ad hoc, and tendentiously put together. One searches in vain for an analytical basis for generating such a list. Under the conditions, perhaps a better way to approach this decolonization agenda is to continue to engage with the still pertinent, albeit vexed question of who speaks for whom. Are the disciplinary wrongs to be righted out of a sense of guilt and shamefaced realization of what could have been, or does it entail mapping, as Bernard Corn did in an exemplary fashion in the case of India, the changes that had been engendered due to colonialism and its forms of knowledge, and anthropology's involvement in that knowledge formation? Hence, a decolonizing agenda has to be more than just the study of populations and concerns seemingly overlooked in what has come to be constituted as canonical. That would only add a few more thesis topics, perhaps. A decolonizing agenda has to reckon with the dialectics between knowledge generated by experts, that is us, anthropologists, and the increasing scrutiny of such knowledge by the population studied. From where I speak, that is India, as a South Asianist, decolonization once implied a re-examination of habits of the heart and struggles to liberate the mind from the naturalness of imported categories, from hegemonic prefabricated claims that are dexterously and delicately forged yet steadfastly put together. Today, in this hyper-connected world, one perhaps has to add the task of laying bare the circuits of academic clientelism operating increasingly through the diasporic academic communities with close connections to native elites. This acquires unprecedented salience for American anthropology establishment in particular, since its university systems are singularly open to circulation of students and scholars from everywhere. To that extent, we need to take a more granular approach to this project of decolonization to examine the wheels within the wheels. To come back to my earlier point, decolonization of anthropology is not an exclusive or autonomous project undertaken by American anthropology. Hence, it may be rather restrictive to conceptualize it as such, more so because of its global reach since the Second World War. Any such effort on the part of American anthropology could immensely benefit from a closer examination of struggles with varying degrees of success and viability by national traditions of the discipline, for want of a better word. To that extent, the decolonizing impetus of US anthropology has to walk a tightrope of mapping the global connections while being mindful of perils of aggregating colonialisms, which runs the risk of conflating the issues, losing sight of the contextual and socially circumscribed realities and the solutions proffered. There are no easy solutions to such realities, and the task, therefore, is to denaturalize that it is possible to conflate all kinds of colonialisms, whether inside the US or outside, while keeping the disciplinary practices of examining them as increasingly interconnected. This task is perhaps best captured by Paul Rabinow in his reflections on fieldwork in Morocco, where he evocatively acknowledges, and I quote, the enormous difficulties and complexities involved in the comprehension of the other. Decolonization, thus, has to be embarked on with as much emotional and moral honesty as intellectual honesty, and what we are willing to subject to revision in the light of new experiences. As a discipline, how do we constitute it? As science in a positivistic vein, or emphasizing on the experiential, reflective, and critical aspects of actual inquiry through the practice of fieldwork? So this is the second sort of conundrum, the second sort of issues. The third issue, or another significant arena, as I see in this debate, for the decolonization project, identified also by Gupta and Stoolman, is the academic cultures of American anthropology departments. This includes a range of initiatives starting from transforming curricula, inducting students and colleagues from hitherto underrepresented constituencies, and change what comprises standard publishing practices and norms. In many ways, the question of diversity in hiring, building solidaristic understandings with the communities studied, and what counts as legitimate knowledge production are bound to be shared concerns of cognate disciplines and departments. How do we do it in anthropology per se? So that's a moot question. However, in addition to these ones, like transforming the curricula and so on, perhaps we need to examine some unwritten precepts to configure the discipline and departments. For instance, if both Gupta and Lewis are to agree that everyone studying everyone could be one of the possible touchstones of a decolonized anthropology, could we examine what prevents that possibility as a first step towards decolonization? Short of a global revolution, what could we do to cultivate the conditions of possibility where there are many lane circulations of African, Asian, or Latin American anthropologists studying communities, cultures, and phenomenon of anthropological interest in North America or Western Europe? Let me phrase it a little more starkly and concretely. Is it in the imaginative realm of an admissions committee of a graduate program in any American anthropology department that a South Asian student could propose to study a decaying industrial town from the Rust Belt or an evangelical community in American South and be successful in her application? What would be the apprehensions running through the minds of the committee? What are the odds that a graduate student from elsewhere is encouraged to study a North American phenomenon using anthropological techniques deployed almost spontaneously on other cultures? Do we have comparable meditations on dangerous field encounters of a Black or Hispanic ethnographer studying a racially surcharged county, like an American ethnographer studying war-torn Syria or Baghdad? I ask these questions as much out of curiosity. So I would want some of you to respond to my curiosity. But the general point I seek to drive home is that perhaps we need to go beyond diversity and examine the conditions that foreclose the possible generation of certain kinds of knowledge. One could take this line of questioning to the problem of the political economy of academic funding, its allocation and expenditure priorities. We need to reckon how knowledge is generated or pre-filtered through invisible seeds. A decolonizing project in academia also has to critically relook at the sheer industrialization of academic practice in terms of turnout of publications and give emphasis on other types of academic work, especially teaching and mentoring in settings which are increasingly diverse. Only when we take Du Bois' question of how do we counteract the various forms of colonialism that are global and interlinked seriously, can we begin to seek solutions to the newer forms of colonialisms that beset our discipline. That is, the hold of hegemonic discourses and standardized practices of disciplinary excellence that makes other modes of disciplinary practice under par. Decolonizing US anthropology would then have to interrogate its exclusivism in terms of its hallowed history and take into account not only other cultures, but other locations of knowledge production that can productively inform the field. This is not a plea for acknowledging the lessons of post-colonial studies or critical theory or any other fashionable isms, but one that alongside the study of the diversity of human behavior now squarely acknowledges the diverse ways of studying that diversity and diverse locations from which such a study could happen. Only then, as to quote Herbert Lewis, perhaps anthropology will remain standing at the end of this era, its practitioners still searching for new and better ideas. This is from In Defense of Anthropology, published in 2014. I would end by reiterating that none of what I have flagged are novel and has been said more eloquently from time to time by engaged practitioners of the discipline. In a compendium published in 1988, titled Anthropology for the 90s, Jonetta B. Cole underlined the problem thus: anthropology continues to grow and change in response to new and different phenomena within world societies, to discoveries and insights within the discipline itself, and to the mandate for ever-increasing relevancy that comes from the very people whom anthropologists study. I submit that our discipline has matured and charted new directions by such periodic stock-taking that preserves both the originary impetus of the discipline, even as it rethinks its identity as a dynamic and self-reflexive academic endeavor. Thank you for indulging me. Thank you for your time.
You go, Dr. D. Thank you very much. I've been also looking at the comments and seeing that people are eager to ask questions, but we did in our plan have some time reserved at this point for both groups to respond. So I think we'll just go ahead and do that, but maybe we can keep it short, and I will be particular about time here so that we do have some time for questions, but we'll begin with Jesse and Akhil, and then after a response from Jesse and Akhil, Herbert will respond, and then we'll move on to questions. Right, thank you.
Jesse,
go ahead, Dr. Gupta. I'm still collecting my thoughts, but I guess I can just begin by saying thank you so much, Dr. D, for unpacking the debate in a really productive way. And I think I'm just ruminating, and I hope we have more time for thinking about the many provocations you had in terms of what this decolonization looks like on a material level. And I think that our article sort of wanted to encourage that sort of reflection, particularly in terms of both the everyday practices of departments and beyond. So at the granular and the more conceptual, but I'll leave it to Dr. Gupta if he wants to provide more response.
So I just want to say thank you. That was a really thoughtful and wonderful response. I just wanted to clarify one thing about, when you said that list of topics was arbitrary, that we selected. I'll tell you why it wasn't arbitrary, because what I was saying there, what I was thinking at that point was that if I was looking circa 1900 or 1910, I was looking at what had happened in the immediate past to the communities with which I was working, namely Native American communities and African American communities. What would be the main concerns that they might have had, right? So that list comes out of there. That's what generates that list. It's not saying that in today's world, these are the most important questions. What I'm saying is, if those had been the most important questions at that time, then we would have a different history of anthropology, a different body of literature with which we were currently struggling. And currently we would be struggling with it, we would be criticizing it, we would be whatever we would be doing with it, but it would be a different body of literature, right? And so that was what I was saying. So I'm not saying today's, for example, I would say climate change would be my biggest issue for a future anthropology. Climate change, migration, issues of migration, issues of racial justice. I mean, those are the issues that are really important in the current era. Issues of, say, poverty, and issues having to do with people's, indigenous people losing their land to deforestation and national policies in countries like Brazil and Indonesia. The locus has shifted, many of the problems remain the same. So I would propose a different set of things, but that was the only point I'd make. And I love what you have to say about the mix between, that there's always a tension between kind of keeping the center of the field, like saying, okay, this is what was important to the field, boundary maintenance and openness, right? And I think that my perspective is that you have to leave room for the openness. It doesn't mean that you throw away what you have. It means that you ask new questions of what you already have, of the literatures. So contrary to what Dr. Lewis said, we are not saying, we never say, and we don't say that we should throw away what we have learned from the past, that we don't consider it useful. On the contrary, we think it's extremely useful. We're not launching an assault on anthropology's history. In fact, all we are saying is, like every other generation has done, we need to ask new questions of that record, of the ethnographic record. And we have to broaden what we consider to be the ethnographic record. So when Native American scholars and communities, and African American scholars and communities, and Latinx scholars and communities and Asian American scholars and communities tell us that you have misrepresented, you anthropologists have misrepresented our past, we need to listen to that. We need to listen to them. We can't be telling them, as anthropologists, as the expert, we know what you're saying is incorrect, right? We can't be dismissing their concerns. And so the question is, as the indigenous scholar Michael Lambert says, anthropologists have been anthrosplaining to Native American communities what it is that they should be understanding of their own traditions. So I'm saying, let's listen to them and use that as a way to change the discipline, to change the way we do our work, change who we think we are, who we are accountable to, right? And that is one way in which we can decolonize the discipline. So I'll stop.
Thank you. Thank you. Professor Lewis.
There are so many things to respond to. But let me just take the most recent thing that Akhil Gupta just said. You are assuming that because someone is, I think you said Asian or Native American or Black, says something that almost by the fact that of their color, we have to believe it. Don't you think there may be alternative possibilities of what people think? For example, you quote very happily, you have to quote William Willis's article, Skeletons in the Anthropological Closet from 1972 or 3, but you don't bother to talk about his piece of 1975 in which he talks about the absolute significance of, pardon me for mentioning Franz Boas, but he does come up very often, of his importance working with Black scholars and on Black folklore and just how significant that is. And then you don't really tell us that he spent his last couple of years with the wonderful William Willis, who was so badly treated by the discipline of anthropology, deeply, deeply engaged in pursuit of a study of Franz Boas, who says was so misunderstood as an anthropologist and as a person. Or you cite, of course you have to cite Vine Deloria, that nice article that appeared in Playboy that shook up the whole field. But while you cite Beatrice Medicine, his cousin, you don't bother to say how badly she thinks of that and how destructive that particular piece has been. You cite all sorts of things in your paper that are disingenuous. For example, by having Assad of 1973, who was specifically talking about British anthropology and who furthermore specifically said, no, they were not working on behalf of colonialism. And you cite Remy, for example, who is simply quoting other people. There's disingenuousness in these citations. There are things that you mention that I can't even find. Tall Bear is supposed to be talking about anthropology. There's not a word about anthropology in it. As far as I can see, Abu al-Nahaj is supposed to be talking about the native wisdom of dealing with the human relation animals. No, there's not a word about that. There is a disingenuousness, and you have said here, I do not want to focus on the many ways in which Dr. Lewis misreads our paper. You can read it yourself and come to your own conclusions. You talk about the genocide of California. I mean, this will be my last point. There were people writing about that genocide, but more than that, you ignore the fact that within the vast corpus of anthropological writings about American Indians, there is a great deal about the breaking of treaties, about dispossession, about genocide even. You just throw that away. You just ignore it. And what's worse, you issue this apology to indigenous peoples for the way things were extracted from them without recognizing that under the circumstances and the times, just how they were feeling about having somebody talk to them about their language, about having somebody interested in their work, about saving, specifically Hoffman is told, the chiefs of wanted me to record this because they think it is changing and passing. Let me just quote someone who is on here. I hope he won't mind, but he has published this. Peter Whiteley, who's worked for many, many years with the Hopi collaborators. In the long run, Native American ethnography has been, by no means consciously, a principal means of subverting the premises of colonial reason rather than one of its tools. Despite its multiple problems, discursive, ethical, and interpretive, ethnography has been the most powerful contributor to intercultural knowledge and important philosophical complication the world has ever seen. Ethnography has been an important vehicle to preserve a record of indigenous voices, languages, cultural ideas and practices, and social histories, a primary source for recuperation of past forms that are otherwise simply unavailable to Native people or others. Contemporary revitalization of Native rituals and beliefs has often depended on the published canon of ethnography. Aside from the value of this work, this is me, not him now, for Indian land claims and for other human and civil rights cases, Whiteley adds, for those who would listen, ethnography as a vehicle for the translation and transmission of serious cultural knowledge has greatly deepened understanding of what it means to be a human being. And I am afraid, Jesse and Akhil, you have totally dismissed it. Saying that you're not, you actually have, by the many sources and by the failure to ever mention it.
Many thanks. These are clearly important issues, and this discussion is definitely not going to be limited to the 2 hours we've set aside. There's not closure here, as has already been pointed out. We have questions that have been submitted by students and some others, and we'll go ahead and go to those. At the same time, many of you who are here in the room have questions, and what we'll be doing is if you can, we'll just use the raise hands for that.
EJ,
and if
what I've been doing is to people in the room, if you have questions, put them on chat. EJ's taking care of the initial questions, and I'll make sure you're in order. So Susan, I think you had your hand up first, and after EJ is done with the questions she got, as long as we still have time. But I think we do want to stop somewhere right at 8 o'clock. But I'll take care of the questions that people put in chat, but please put them in there. I'll have them in sequence.
Excellent, thank you. And what I will do, because there's obviously too many questions for the remaining few minutes that we have, is I'm just gonna choose a few of these questions that came in. Initially, I'll take a couple of questions from Pamela Freeberg Savelsberg's students, and we'll just start. There's no good place to start, so I'll just start with this one here, and we'll open it for our speakers and so forth to comment on. How would one evaluate research that does not follow the resource extraction model or a more quote unquote measurable type of output? What would the methods, modes, criteria for evaluation have to change to be, or would they need to be removed completely? How would this translate to anthropological research and projects done in classrooms/colleges that require a grade?
So I guess the question was directed at me. And, you know, the whole issue of grading and how we, in general, try to evaluate work, the quality of the work of somebody, you can approach it in many different ways. You can try to think about, oh, does this research in fact show collaboration, demonstrate collaboration? Does it acknowledge the people who helped the researcher in a central way? Does it give, for example, just the notion that, one person's name should be on a publication in which many, many different people have contributed to the knowledge that is generated in that article. There are very different practices regarding that in the biological sciences versus the anthropology. And why we as a discipline have come up with a template that says that we should not include the names of our many collaborators in our publications is something that is in some ways just purely arbitrary, right? There's no real reason why our publications don't have 5 authors or 6 authors or 10 authors and acknowledge everybody whose input led to that. It's just a disciplinary practice. In the same way that I once asked George Stocking why we had the disciplinary practice of changing the names of people in our field sites. And when did that begin? Who started this practice, right? And the general answer is that it's meant to protect our informants, but sometimes that may not be a relevant consideration, and people may want to be named. They want to be co-author of an article, but we say, no, we're going to decide for you how this should be done. We don't necessarily honor your request and your interest in being listed as a co-author. So there's many ways in which we could be thinking about how we evaluate work, how we honor work, how we give work its significance. And in terms of, so that's a larger question of grading. It's not just about grading for the class, but it's also about evaluation for the discipline. And we should be looking at all of those. All of those should be on the table and try to think about a decolonizing anthropology.
Thank you. I'm kind of thinking in the interest of time, rather than going, Gitika, Jesse, Herbert, what do you have to say? We'll just go through a few of these questions, and a different person can choose to answer this next one, although this one is probably for Dr. Lewis. Suppose we could ask our anthropological ancestors to listen to today's conversation. And this question is coming from Govind Peter Witteveen. Framed from the world they inhabited and in the ways of making scholarly knowledge back then, what might they make of the distinctions and concerns that are being articulated today? Dr. Lewis, you're muted.
I'm sorry, what I said was, Govind, my old friend and student, why did you throw me such a curveball? I don't know. I'm going to take the fifth on this. I'm not sure.
I apologize. I had no idea that there was any connection between you two.
No,
Someone else want to take this?
That's quite all right. Yeah, maybe somebody else would like to try that. Would you repeat the question?
May I? This is Peter Whiteley. Thank you, Herb, for reading a quote from me. I really appreciate that. Yeah, it's impossible to answer that, of course, but I do think that we need to attend to additional histories of what's already in the record. Maybe we have just been reading the record of past anthropological practice with too narrow a focus. Maybe to tell a story about the history of the discipline that fits with the limited framework of what can be taught in graduate school or undergraduate school in the field. But I just would like to read something briefly, a quote from Lewis Henry Morgan, speaking about the Senecas of Western New York in 1847, 4 years before the publication of League of the Haudenosaunee, which is sometimes reckoned, sort of mythologically as the founding ethnography of the discipline. And he says this: the Senecas, their broad territories have been narrowed down to gratify the demands of the white man until they no longer measure their possessions from river to river, from lake to lake, but by acres and surveyors' lines. 4 reservations in Western New York contain all that is left of their great domain. One of these, the Buffalo, has already fallen into the hands of the Ogden Land Company after 10 years' investment, during which these merciless speculators have waded through a sea of iniquity to grasp the red man's patrimony. The Tonawanda Reservation is also in their relentless grasp, and ere the year closes, 600 Senecas will be compelled to expatriate themselves and solicit a home in Canada if this stupendous iniquity be not arrested. Verily, the blood of the Senecas is about to be shed upon the altars of avarice. Is this a heathen land that such a sacrifice should be permitted? Have justice and humanity fled? It is to be feared that in all after years there will rise up from the grave of the red man never-ending and just reproaches against our want of generosity, our great injustice. All of which is to say that I think there has been an imbrication of awareness of the effects of settler colonialism within an emergent field of anthropology since day one, since Morgan, since before Morgan's ethnography. This is available in the record for us to find, these kinds of speeches by people like Francis LaFleche and Alice Fletcher and J.N.B. Hewitt and so on and so on and so on. It's all there. So the fact that we don't know about it or don't seem to know as much about it as we ought to is really our own fault. And we ought to, be more rigorous in our interrogation of the history of the discipline.
Thank you, Peter. I'll comment that the questions that have been submitted by students are pretty much, none of them really are related to the history. They're all sort of looking to the future. I'm going to give one more question from Pamela Feldman-Spalsberg's group, and then we'll move on to the questions from this group that Victor will moderate. In Anthropology's decolonizing project, should there be emphasis on redressing the lasting damaging consequences on present-day Indigenous groups through monetary donations and the repatriation of land, for example? Keeping Indigenous futurity and cultural sustainability in mind, in what ways can students and scholars of anthropology make a concrete difference in their research, work, and social justice initiatives? Herbert, Jesse, Gitika.
Yeah, maybe I can just start by saying it seems like that question should always be central to beginning any project of study, and it cannot be singular for any, for all projects and all possibilities of collaboration. But I think making that question the question that begins a possible research project would really help reorient the way that we determine what is scholarly relevant, what is worth it. I think that would be an ideal way to move forward.
Hi, if I can also respond from my location. So I think this is a question also which has been asked by Professor Gupta and Jesse in their speech, which is the question of how do we help the communities we study? Now, I think if I have understood the question correctly, because it's all about addressing certain kinds of injustices and so on. So this is a question which is kind of, I think, it's thorny for the simple reason that when we do field work here, one of the questions, one of the concerns that the communities ask us is how is your research going to help us? And the question is that we are there purely to understand an issue, understand a problem. We are not actually there to help them in any way. I mean, in the sense, I mean, the only thing that they probably ask us to do is to either see whether there is any monetary benefit for them, because also the field in India, and I don't know how it is in America, but the field in India also, people look at anthropologists as people who are activists from non-governmental organizations, the NGOs. So there is a sort of an NGOization of anthropology. I mean, if we have to talk about the global South in a way, and that's a vexed question. I mean, what are we doing as anthropologists? Is it our task to help the communities in terms that they want us to help? Which is, you know, as I said, I mean, it's complicated. It's also complex. So those questions we need to think about, that what are we doing as anthropologists? Are we purely seeking knowledge, or are we also in some ways trying to contribute to the communities and enhance knowledge about them so that they can be helped? So I think the debate lies there.
Right. So, Victor?
Let me unmute. We have 3 questions, and the people can ask themselves. So we first Susan Trencher, and then Louise Lamphere and Mark Collard. Those are the 3 people, and probably we won't have much time for more than that. So Susan and Keho will be number 4. Susan, did you hear me? Susan Trencher? Hello? She had a question, but I don't think she put it
So
on.
let's go, we'll go ahead and go on to Louise.
Louise?
Hi, I'm Louise Lamphere, retired from the University of New Mexico. And I'm wondering what the role of collaborative anthropology can be in this decolonization process. And there's a lot of it going on. Archaeologists, cultural anthropologists, and probably biological anthropologists as well. And I think one of the things is that particularly the school of this that has been sort of developed out of public health sort of starts with the questions that you should be asking are ones that the community wants you to study. So you work together to work out what the research problem is at the very beginning. And then you involve the community in, there are various ways to be able to do this in the study all along. You can also train students to do interviewing and participate. But also when you get to the point of a public presentation, they need to be involved in what they ought to be. So that's a way in which you can change the relationship of the studier, the anthropologist, and the studied, but also get to a topic that people really want have some interest in. And I think it is in a very important way of decolonizing anthropology. And maybe Akhil, you could address this, or Herb, I don't know, maybe you want to say something about it, and Jesse as well.
Yeah, I can take a quick start. Collaborative anthropology, I think, is one of the central ways in which one can think about a decolonizing method in anthropology. And it's many of the examples you give. Archaeologists have been involved in this. Medical anthropologists have been involved in this. And also it has a long history, right? So it's not as if people just started doing it recently. They've been doing it. Many anthropologists have been doing that work since the very beginnings of the discipline, but they're not necessarily our most celebrated, ancestors, disciplinary ancestors. And that's part of what we're saying is like, maybe we should think about reevaluating, rethinking, and repositioning some of those people in the disciplinary canon. The other place where I think, your comment points to, which is really interesting, is that collaborative anthropology and thinking about what problems are important to the communities that we are studying is not necessarily in conflict with doing theoretically innovative work, right? So you can be working on problems that are important to the community, but doing it, you can be contributing to theoretical scholarship at the same time as you're contributing in real practical ways to people's lives.
Alice wants to say something.
I think we have another question that Victor was going to queue up before Alice.
Well, I have Susan Trencher's long statement here, and I think there's a question there, but let me read it. Dr. Gupta, I appreciate that you do not want to focus on the many ways in which Dr. Lewis has misread your paper, but this does not seem to me an adequate response to the question of why your address included any of this material in the first place. Dr. Lewis presents a different reading of the past, but this is only an issue because you raised it in a way that can be read, as I myself did, as diminishing it. Why not just set out what you see as the priorities for the future? There is an implicit integration of the past embedded in your focus to the diverse, equitable, and inclusion focus of the future. Certainly a cultural agenda for future study. So I think she's asking, what is the agenda for the future? Is to distill that. I'm not sure if that's a question. Is that correct, Susan?
Well,
and it also, I don't know if is Susan here?
I'm here. I'm here.
Okay, good.
Oh, the question was really directed to a paper that frankly I read as Look Back in Anger, and which was the beginning of the focus. And it might not have been angry, but it was certainly critical in a way that made no sense to me relative to the intent, I think, of the work, or the presentation, that was, what should the future of anthropology focus on? It so happens that the future of anthropology in this particular focus is an American agenda right now, and is an agenda that anthropologists, I think, around the world would agree to. But it is a cultural moment, and this is a reflection of the cultural moment. And we have a job as anthropologists to understand our own cultural moment and the things that it produces. So the question is, why include the past? Why not just focus on the present and what one sees as the agenda that matters for now?
Maybe I can start with a response. First, the feelings that this paper produced have been discussed a lot today. I've heard guilt mentioned and anger. And for me, it's curious that a paper asking that we continue to read the ethnographic record and look for, as Dr. Whitley has noted and others today, what people said about, what these ancestors said about settler colonialism, indigenous dispossession, enslavement and its legacies, and making that the focus of our reading. Because of course, when you read any text, you can't get everything out of it at that reading. But when you have that as a focus, it can engender new ways of moving forward in the discipline and finding ways to conduct research in an ethical and decolonizing manner. So I guess I'm confused by the response of thinking that we were asking, for example, that everyone feel a sense of guilt as they look at the ethnographic record. And as a scholar in training, I must say that doing the research for this paper, it was an incredibly formative event. I was able to learn things about anthropology that I did not get from my 3-series history of anthropology courses that I had through my training, because 3 series can't cover everything, of course. So I guess I don't see the implicit duality of either you read the historical record and you don't think about, future is built off of what could have been done, and continuing to ask ourselves the question of how do we produce a more decolonizing discipline.
I'll just add to that there was no anger, and we are definitely not trashing the history of the discipline and the practitioners who came before, right? What we are saying is respecting them means rereading them. And that is what with every new problem space, that is what you do. You reread how you got here, and that enables you to launch a different future. But that is showing respect. Reading to be read critically is being shown respect, in my view, as a scholar, right? So if people write things about my previous work in which they're critical of it, but they read it carefully and they engage with it, that's all I can ask for, right? That's the highest form of praise that you can give me as a scholar. So this is, so I just want to emphasize that we are not reading this angrily. We are not reading it with a view of dismissing what our anthropological ancestors did and said. What we are saying is, let's ask new questions.
Let's have Herbert respond.
Yeah, I'm afraid, I must say that the disingenuousness, I hate to say this, Jesse, I realize you're a student here and you've talked about the 3 courses you took, but there's nothing, with the exception of maybe Darnell's 2 books, that suggests the historicity, an actual historiographical study of anthropology. You stoop so low, if I may say so. The citation of Blackhawk and Wilner is an example of why one shouldn't take references at face value or judge a book by its blurb. My friend Jim Scott should have read it before claiming that the book is a revelatory and transformative volume for our understanding of what Boaz became, thanks to the instruction of his indigenous compatriots. Of the 14 articles in the book, only 1 tries, rather debatably, to make that claim. Can you imagine that? The blurb says that what Boaz became, thanks to the instruction of indigenous compatriots, not a single one other than Isaiah Wilner even suggests such a thing. You haven't read the book. And there are many examples of this sort of thing, and why you only have negative works, not a single positive one. It is so disingenuous to say that you were just rethinking the history of anthropology. You are just putting every negative one that you possibly can.
I'm afraid we'll just have to disagree on that. You can read,
and that includes also 2 that are so nasty, that you cite. One about Zora Neale Hurston, one by Audra Simpson about Boaz and Morgan. That is so shocking. Not only it's just a trashing job, and to cite it without reading it, without thinking of what it's actually saying, realizing that it makes no sense. This is not honest scholarship. I'm sorry.
So we clearly have more work to do to continue this conversation, to move things forward. We've opened up a big project, and we're going to have to work hard to come to some productive ends here. Victor, I don't think we're going to have time for that, for a 3rd, let alone a 4th, 5th, 6th question, and we're going to have to close it out. So shall I leave that job to you?
1 second, because Cahill
Yes.
has been raising her hand for about 30 minutes, and I think
I'm going to apologize because I'm going to have to skedaddle.
Okay, so last question, Cahill? She doesn't seem to be responding here. Okay, so I think this is, EJ, I think we're at the end because she's not taking the opportunity. Okay, so I think there is closure for our meeting now, but I don't think there's been any closure on this discussion. However, I hate to use cliches, but I use them when I'm lazy. There's been a lot of food for thought in these discussions. You know, my wife and I never agree on anything, but we're still married. And hopefully Herb and Akhil can continue to agree and disagree and probably share coffee or a beer together sometime at a AAA meeting and keep arguing.
Absolutely. This is the productive tension, and we're moving somewhere eventually, yes?
And thank God for Dr. D, who put it all into very academic and complicated but amazing ideas about how to connect the two perspectives. So thank you all for coming. And EJ, last words?
Farewell.
Farewell. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you so much.